I'm Dana Bourland with the JPB Foundation, and Nancy, I think I was actually still at Enterprise when I heard about SPARCC, which was almost 5 years ago. So this is a very, very special day, and I know our president, Barbara Pickauer, wishes she could be here today. SPARCC just sort of really brings to life our very core values at JPB of working together in collaboration and attacking these really complex issues in their complexity. And so we're thrilled to be a partner of SPARCC. And where we're going to end today is really talking about the environment, which sizably and measurably impacts human and natural systems, health, and well-being. So the panel today is going to really look at how we create equity and opportunity that benefits both people and the planet. And so we have Rapson, a longtime hero of mine from his early days of protecting one of my favorite places in the world, the Boundary Area Waters Canoe Area up in Minnesota. But as president now of the Kresge Foundation, he's really repositioning this 92-year-old institution to tackle these issues in their full complexity, and is really leading the way in philanthropy as he undertakes things such as the Grand Bargain and Detroit and other initiatives I'm sure we'll hear about. And Rhea is an emerging heroine of mine. We're just getting to know each other through some work we're doing around energy efficiency for all, but as president of NRDC, with 500 plus scientists and lawyers and just some of the best staff I've had the fortune of working with, she's really looking at how to make one of the country's most effective environmental organizations also play a leading role in building more equity and alignment in the environmental movement. And Nathaniel Smith, who's the Chief Equity Officer at the Partnership for Southern Equity and Director of Partnerships for Equitable Development at Emory University Center for Community Partnership. We just met today, but I've heard of your great work in your role of really facilitating more balanced and sustainable, inclusive development across the Atlanta region. So we have a great panel, but please, I want your questions now so we can jump right in. While racial equity is clearly an issue, what would you say to the urban poor white population who hears about attention, investment for people of color and feels left behind? Now that doesn't quite hit our theme outright of addressing environmental equity, but it does. I mean, these issues are really intertwined, and we're really trying to embrace the complexity. So I think it does actually directly relate to what we're talking about.
So let me first thank the funders and partners who have come together in such a critical time to create SPARCC, and also a shout out to my ATL crew that are here and a part of the SPARCC network in Atlanta. In actuality, as I attempt to do the work, one of the main figures in my life that has guided me, of course, is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he was a son of Atlanta, a graduate of Morehouse College, and one of the preeminent voices for justice during the civil rights movement. Dana, he had a saying or a mantra that he would utilize called the network of mutuality, that we are bound together by this network of mutuality, and that what affects one directly affects all indirectly. And I would say to communities that may not necessarily understand, in particular, with this conversation around climate and sustainability, or whether it be economic inclusion or access, that what happens on the south side does affect what happens on the north side. What happens on the east side affects what happens on the west side. And because of the political culture that we are experiencing in America today, a culture of otherness, of looking at the other as the enemy, We've minimized our opportunity to come together as a human family and begin the process of implementing policies that are not only good for our planet, but good for everybody.
Maybe I could take it in a slightly different direction and steal shamelessly from something Rhea said to our board just a couple of weeks ago when she spoke to us. My sense is that the power of the local models that we've seen today is just stunning. And then the imperatives of the sort of the broad overarching issues of equity, using these community-based opportunities as a way of drawing in the environmental movement, as a way of drawing in health systems, sort of raises the question of how do we organize our work in the sort of next era of whatever this next era is going to be. And what Rhea suggested, forgive me, Rhea, you can do this better in a moment, but what Rhea suggested, sorry, I hope this is what Rhea suggested, is that we have a moment in which the power of interweaving movement building is really profound. That one of the things that we've tried to do at Kresge is to try to draw together the social justice community and the environmental community. I think, as Shelley said earlier, drawing our environmental movement into the places we live and we work. And the possibility of creating a sort of a set of mobilizing structures that is actually doing work that matters in local places, but that demonstrates a different sensibility about how you cross disciplines. It's not just sort of a technical exercise in creating a transit-oriented development project. It's a way of thinking about how you make community change, and I think we've heard that all day, that this is about power relationships, it's about decision-making capacity, it's about the integration of public and private and civic institutions into sort of one broad problem-solving table. And I just think that I can't look at these models and not think that in many ways they are the future of our community. Does that then drop down into Detroit and into New Orleans and to other communities that aren't part of the cohort? Absolutely. I was actually thinking that I could sort of tick through the 5 or 6 themes that have so powerfully been articulated today and apply them directly into Detroit. It's quite extraordinary, because even though these are communities that are you are communities that are well on your way to true innovation, it has direct application for folks who are dealing with less resources, fewer resources, who have different political structures. I mean, the differences are important, but they aren't determinative. And so that's one way I would answer the question, is I think we really have a moment in which not only can we, but we must weave across these different movement building opportunities.
Yeah, cool? I'm going to go to another question, and then you can answer Rip or his quote of you and correct it or riff on your own quote. But you know, I think a couple of the questions speak to timing. And given everything that's going on in our world, and specifically here domestically, why SPARCC, but why the climate? Why now? Why bringing these issues together now?
So let me just start off by saying thank you for having me here. It's a tremendously exciting day after many, many years of planning. It's just fantastic to see this finally launched. I guess I'll answer that question by acknowledging the reality that these are dark, dark days. I will personally admit that I am trying almost every day to kind of get over it, and yet every day there's a fresh new horror that is even more surprising. So I'm like surprised all the time, and I just got to get over it at some point. Although there's probably a good part of not getting over it, right, that we all need to kind of hang on to. But in these dark, dark days that we find ourselves in, SPARCC, what's happening with SPARCC, what's happening in the communities associated with SPARCC are not only the beacons of light, they are showing us the path forward, right? I was having a conversation with some staff earlier today about some work we're doing in California, and I was saying, look, progress cannot be stopped. and we cannot be stopped. And I think SPARCC will demonstrate on a very profound and meaningful and powerful level that the work that we're doing here has legs, the work that we're doing here will be transformative, and the work that we're doing here will not be stopped.
A couple of the other questions are asking about the connectivity, really, between the community development conversations we've been having today and the environmental sector. And, I think so oftentimes, maybe historically, we've been so focused on the benefit and sort of the pending capital project, to get the ribbon cut, get the project done, bring that one benefit. But even what you were talking about, Rhea, we no longer have that luxury of thinking about these issues in their individual silos, of providing housing without access to nature, or just asphalting over a river because it's just too polluted. And so maybe you could each address these other questions that really are asking what's the importance of this connection of bringing environmental interventions with community development interventions?
Well, I was struck by a number of comments this morning that essentially asked the question of why is this different from past comprehensive community development initiatives? And I go back a long way to 5 or 6 sort of major efforts to do it. And I think Darren pegged it. The isolation of the disciplines, the isolation of the sectors, the isolation of the sort of the on-the-ground decision-making processes was a sort of an inherent artificiality. You couldn't break through to sort of long-term enduring change unless you began to understand that these are all kind of ricocheting against each other. And I think Don's example was perfect. Health bangs into transportation, bangs into income supports, bangs into housing. And I think this is fundamentally different in a way that, and I've been doing this work for 25 years, I don't think we've ever seen this kind of horizontal integration, both at the community level, but I think one of the things we haven't talked as much about is also vertically. You have NRDC, you have LIF, you have all of these partners who are as good at what they do as anyone in the country, and the possibility of sort of integrating this sort of deep technical expertise with this sort of broad coalition building going on at the local level is a really powerful model that I don't think we've seen in the community development field for at least since I've been in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I'll also say, just to be completely transparent, I think within the context of the community development world, in many places in urban areas around the country, development has happened to people and not with people. Within the context of our environmental conversation, it has been a majority white conversation that has left out communities of color and have not leveraged the passion and the history of people of color in engaging in critical conversations about resiliency and about the environment. My biggest concern and why SPARCC is so critical and important is that while we may work to weave these various interests together, without the authentic voices of people of color who have fought this fight in America for the past 400 years and through blood, sweat, and tears made America great, we will not have an opportunity to move in the policy way that we need to move in order to make a community for everyone. One case in particular, I would say, is really this conversation around resiliency. And it's funny how it really depends on what side of the spectrum you are in terms of how you see resiliency. For well-heeled individuals who look at the term resiliency, they think about being able to manage the shocks of our environment or economy or social impacts. For people that live in the hood, resiliency means I'm still here. They have lived in communities for decades without any real investments or really any real support systems. And so SPARCC actually creates an opportunity to minimize what we've seen through the community development boom that has happened in urban areas, where fiscal policy and the resources that have been leveraged off of the backs of poor folks have been used to create new markets that are now pushing them out. If we don't, and are not strategic about the conversation about climate and resiliency, we're going to see again new policies that are being initiated like green infrastructure, policies that focus on gray infrastructure, policies that focus on, solar or wind as we now move into our new green energy economy, that will be positioned in a way to not only leave folks of color behind, but exploit folks of color and move them aside so new economies and new communities can grow off of the backs of the people that have suffered. So that is my concern and why SPARCC is so critical and important.
Yeah, well said. Well said. We have a question here, Rhea, I'm going to direct it towards you at first. If we're able to move the needle on equity, how do we keep environmental justice leaders and their organizations at this collaborative table? And I think some might view NRDC as sort of an odd partner at this table. So maybe you can speak to your work and just how you might answer that question from your experience.
Sure. Let me suggest one thing. If there is one thing that you remember from what I say, this conversation today, today's celebratory events about environmental organizations or about the environment, it's this. Environmental rights are human rights, and they always have been. The whatever term we want to use now, intersectionality, community-based focus, these are central to why the environmental movement was created in the first place. And I think over the course of time, different environmental organizations have evolved in different ways, but make no mistake about it, and I'll speak for NRDC, the heart and the soul of our mission is around the pursuit of justice, around the pursuit of equitable rights for all. And so finding the opportunities where that actually comes so clearly into the fore with SPARCC is incredibly exciting, but it is also, again, it's bringing us back home. It's fulfilling the basic core of the mission that we were created to pursue. So I can't wait to be at lots of different meetings in the future with lots of different community rights organizations, whatever it may be, and not have the question posed to me, as an environmentalist, why are you here? I hope today is the last day that happens, and I hope we prove through the work of SPARCC why that shouldn't be the case. I don't want to not answer the other question that you had, Dana, which is how we can ensure that all of the environmental movements, organizations are appropriately represented at the table. This has been a long-standing tension amongst what's called kind of mainstream big environmental groups and community-based environmental justice groups. I think, frankly, the fact that I'm sitting next to Rip, a leader at the Kresge Foundation, the fact that Darren was here, the fact that there are so many funder partners in the room, there's an acknowledgement, right, that you can't simply set the table without having the right members or the right constituencies invited to that table. And so thinking through the opportunities, not only of how that table should be set, but how organizations like NRDC should create the room and the space and the opportunity for our partners to appropriately be next to us or leading in the conversations around environment, around climate, around equity. I think it's a reframing for funders, it's a reframing for environmental organizations, and it's perhaps a reframing for community-based organizations.
I just wanted to continue to speak on behalf of Rhea. I think the reframing she just referenced is sort of nowhere more powerfully demonstrated in a settlement that NRDC just brokered. So is Flint a community development issue? Yeah. Is it a health issue? Yeah. Is it an environmental issue? I don't know, but NRDC was the entity that worked with the ACLU to sort of drive a suit that brought the state of Michigan as well as the United States government to the table to bring justice to the residents of Flint. And I guess got an $87 million settlement that'll remediate 18,000 pipes. It simply would not have happened without NRDC's lens and skill. I mean, it was really an extraordinary demonstration, I think, of exactly what she's talked about.
As we've been diving into the various sites and meetings that have come about over the past year or more, it does seem, though, that locally some of the communities aren't as prone to sort of lead with solutions around climate resilience. Why do you think that is, or how do you see that changing?
Maybe I could just speak from our experience at Kresge. When I first came to Kresge, our environmental program was providing capital support to zoos. We then brought...
to zoos?
Yeah.
Zoos.
Yeah, aquaria, you pick it, we did it. Which was fine, nothing wrong with zoos. But the point is that then we felt that it was important to sort of move into some kind of environmental space, and we sort of did, I think, what many good environmental funders did. We sort of identified energy and renewable resources and water quality in the upper Midwest, and then it struck us that if Kresge was going to be about urban opportunity for low-income people, which is essentially our organizing principle, that we needed to ask of our environmental team to align to that goal. And what we've done is to try to figure out how essentially low-income people who are disproportionately affected by climate change have a meaningful, pivotal voice in the decisions that affect their future. And at first, our trustees sort of raised their hand and said, you know, look, you got Sierra over here and all these other organizations that have traditionally been sort of technocratic or removed from these sort of social justice issues. It's never going to work. And so we put out an RFP, got, I don't know, however many, hundreds and hundreds of responses back, and are now working with 17 communities in which the social justice movement is inextricably interwoven with the environmental movement. It's not your grandmother's environmental movement, it's not the Kresge environmental movement, but it's the environmental movement. And it's a very interesting blend. And what we're finding is that if it is framed as problem solving, as it was in Flint, as opposed to an environmental issue or a health issue or some combination of the two, if it's simply certifying a problem that needs to be cracked, you can't often crack it without an environmental lens. It just doesn't make any sense. It won't endure. It can't be sustained. And so I think SPARCC has much that same kind of potential, just demonstrating on the ground every day in these 6 communities that these are inextricably interwoven.
I'll always also say that, one of the things that I always say about equity is that equity is not just a what, it is a way. It is a way to do the work that is different than the past, that is inclusive of all voices and creates a platform for the marginalized to be in a position of power in decision-making processes. And so if SPARCC and other folks in philanthropy are committed to the what of equity, it's also important for philanthropy to commit it to the way of equity. And what do I mean by that? Focusing on supporting and galvanizing frontline organizations, not just leaders, but actually focusing on strengthening institutions on the front lines that are focusing on issues of climate, energy, equity, economy, housing, to begin the process of creating that ecosystem on the front lines. We can't just continue to give dollars to people that you know or trust. Right? You have to begin to go into communities, build the capacity that needs to be created in order to move the work forward in a real and different way. Recently, my organization had a conference called the Just Energy Summit in Atlanta, where we had hundreds of people of color in the room talking about climate and energy issues, not just because we sent an invite, but because for the first few months we actually had grassroots on the ground conversations with people of color about energy systems, why it is important to them, why they need to get engaged, and really to get them to understand that power in itself is a double entendre, right? That it's not just about light bulbs or energy efficiency. It's about galvanizing communities of color in a way to build power in a way that will influence policy decision making, right? So we have to begin to live the way of equity and not just, what is equity? And I think the more that philanthropy, the more that partners, the more that intermediaries really understand that, I think the more we'll have a chance to have a more diverse dinner party with different folks around the table partaking on the meal of economic and social environmental prosperity.
Yeah, terrific. We're in our last go-around, so I'm going to try and bring two questions together under one. If you could each address it in your own closing remarks. There seems to be questions about the dollar amount behind SPARCC, really probably not being enough, and wondering how SPARCC will focus other financing on these climate resilience projects, and really, how can SPARCC play a role as federal programs and subsidies are most likely rolling back. So if you could speak to some of the financing and budget issues of SPARCC in your closing remarks in 30 seconds, whoever wants to get us started.
Hey, that's a great, energizing final question. But quite seriously, I think it was part of Rhea's genius to make sure that there was a huge social investment component of this project, because at the end of the day, given the numbers that were thrown up on the board, 12 billion, 13 billion, 9 billion, this is all about leverage, and somehow figuring out how to use non-traditional philanthropic capital to unlock different forms of capital, bringing markets, bringing other kinds of investors into the game, I think is going to be hugely important. I think the grant support is tremendously important to kind of create the backbone support that the organizations need, but ultimately the only way we reach the kinds of results that were articulated throughout the day was when you begin to get larger market forces, larger flows of capital into the mix. So I think it was to Robert Wood Johnson's enormous credit that they put that front and center.
So I'll turn the tables and I'll say what he said. That was really good. Just maybe one additional point. There is a pretty substantial amount of private philanthropy that's dedicated to climate change. There needs to be more of it overall. But if you look at if you look at what that money is actually funding, it's not this work. So there's an opportunity, I think, to make the case that the theory of change for how you solve the climate problem domestically or internationally rests in the hands of communities. So pursuing that, I think, is an additional opportunity to bring new financing and new money to the table.
And I would just piggyback off that, while there is, of course, a growing group of philanthropic organizations that are beginning to look at the challenge of climate change, I think to piggyback and support what you're saying, that we need more funders that are committed to climate justice. And really beginning to understand that this question of justice as it relates to the built environment, as it relates to our economy, as it relates to our environment, is really the central issue of our time. And if you really want to begin the process of influencing the systems that are perpetuating the inequities that we see, whether it be around the environment or other areas, that you have to be willing to put people first and put people who have worked so hard to survive on a day-to-day basis at the center of the conversation. Without that willingness to do that, it's going to be very, very difficult to push back against the regressive policies that we're experiencing on the federal level.
Yeah. Terrific. And we've heard that so loud and clear that SPARCC is really putting people first, community-led voices. So thanks for your terrific remarks and rolling with the punches here at the end of the day. Thank you.